So in Numalo's article this week, she speaks about material discursivity and posits that material does not exist as static, inanimate objects, but rather that materials are active in the shaping of worlds. And as Karen Barad writes, that matter matters. So this deepens our conversation into semiotics, beyond language. In this article, Numalo speaks about how place and materials have semiotic lives, and that they're entangled in the production of worlds and meaning. They move, shift, and produce effects that often humans don't attend to, but regardless of our attention, they continue to respond and shape place. Though Numalo is not using a phenomenological method here, I think that this article pushes us to consider orientations to methodology that could activate an attention beyond only human and beyond only language. So as we think about the Van Manen text, how might this approach be stretched and attend to place, to the materiality of the world as composing and recomposing? So this week I was listening to a podcast called the Cultures of Energy podcast, and feminist environmental humanities scholar Astrida Namus was being interviewed, and I think her ideas are very generative as we think of our roles as teachers and researchers and the porosity of our lives with place and material. So in the podcast, the host shared a quote by Michelle Serro, which says, "The river does not bowl over or bowl along the stone, but rather the river is slowly percolating through the stone." So attending to the relationality of place and how things are always becoming, how might we think of these kinds of relations and the qualities of relations that our current time calls for? How are educators responding to, and how might we nourish these kinds of relations of porosity with place? So following Namus, what kinds of imaginaries are required of us if we are to respond differently, to relate differently in this political moment in the 21st century? So Namus studies water as material and speaks about water as an archive of feeling, an archive that constantly changes and is becoming with others, like the example of the river. She suggests that water and material in place holds memories of human desire, traced with our wants, a material archive almost of the ways in which we act. The remnants of chemicals, plastics, waste materials, and other things that water holds, and how very personal this is. So how place and materials remember these effects and the effects of our actions, a sort of physical manifestation of our ways of being, wants, and desires within this time of advanced capitalism. So in tracing these manifestations, both physically and symbolically, actually and virtually, I wonder as teachers and researchers how we are both accountable to and vulnerable to these effects. And following Myra Hurd's work, I think an ethic of vulnerability, which she writes about, might also be a crucial disposition and orientation toward our research and pedagogical work with children, and that it's not only humans that matter in the construction of worlds, but that we are also vulnerable to materials in place. So as we think about our role as teachers and researchers with place, I think this quote by David Jardine is quite powerful. He writes that in order to know the world, we need to love it. And I think love in this way is not the simple sense of the word. This is not a love that is always happy or always of joy, but following May, perhaps, it lingers in expressions that are both painful and pleasurable. This is a love that is deep and rich because of its confusions, complexities, contradictions, tensions, and thickness. A thickness is living in this relationship with multiple difference, their histories and intersections and difficulties. So what does this require of us? And how do we avoid the abstraction and fragmentation of knowledges that make this kind of radical love impossible in education? So how do we sustain an attention to phenomena that is in-depth, multifaceted, and often contradictory, while maintaining a felt value for knowledge that is alive, that lingers, as May tells us this week? and is situated with place, where time is not spent but rather dwelled with. So in early childhood education, we're often pulled to focus on the developing child who is required to acquire basic skills, and it's often done through stripping down the symbols of literacy and numeracy and reciting these concepts through routine and memorization. And we focus a lot on pre-thought curriculum over situated pedagogy. And as we've read this week, as we'll be reading next week, Van Manen asks, why this fear of pedagogy? So drawing on David Jardine, perhaps we can think of pedagogy as an invitation to the world in all its rawness, where in paying attention and through the arts of noticing, we might be reminded of our relations with place that are so often forgotten. Building knowledges with children in these moments of remembering in the face of neoliberal structures that seek to extract and instrumentalize the dynamic components of place in the pursuit of an economic livelihood. So for your portfolio entry 8, you'll be engaging with an exercise of restoring place. So this framework for this entry has been adapted from a writing exercise provided by Fikile Numalo at the Exploring Climate Change with Young Children Symposium in Ontario last October. So in your entry, consider that place is a concept frequently imbued with socio-cultural and political tensions that may be obscured through a tendency to ascribe anthropocentric meaning to place. So Tuck and Yang suggest that curricula are one way in which the hidden dynamics of settler colonialism are operationalized. So in this portfolio entry, we'll restory the land as a powerful and pedagogical and methodological space for resisting a dominant conception of human land relations. So the purpose of this writing exercise is to confront the narratives obscured by a settler colonial orientation to place and consider the pedagogical possibilities of restoring places we visit in everyday life. So Donald writes that pedagogical work dedicated to the goal of decolonization in Canada must engage critically with the colonial nature of the relationships connecting Aboriginal peoples and Canadians and the logics that circumscribe them. So following this dedication, we'll be experimenting with a decolonial orientation to writing place. So you'll begin with a walk through a local park. The intention here is for you to pay attention to what is illuminated when thinking of the park as place. What do you notice about this place? What evidence do you see of settler and or Indigenous presences? These could be signs, sculptures, artwork, monuments, buildings, a pond, a tree, an animal. So for example, storying place from an orientation responsive to the human and more than human presences here. So if you see a place with both settler and Indigenous presences together, consider if you think that this place is of honored and overlapping difference or of appropriation. So walk for at least 10 minutes and select one site or subject, for example, one that connects to Indigenous presences. Take a photo and write an attuned, responsive, and detailed piece about this site, around 300 or 400 words. Why did you select this subject or site? While the specific histories of this place may be unknown to you, your writing may include questions, curiosities, and imaginary futures as you re-story the site. So as you're writing, think with some of these writing propositions. So restoring more than human presences in anthropocentric spaces or places, restoring places and paying attention to presencing marginalized, such as Black, Indigenous, immigrant place stories. So thinking carefully about what stories are being told in this place, and paying attention to how human geographies reproduce inequity of place. Paying attention to liminal interstitial states of place, contradictory lines of settler and Indigenous presences. And here you might also draw on your artographic methodological orientations. Connections to pedagogy, arts of noticing and possibilities to decenter the human child in relation to place. So what might all of these thoughts and emerging curiosities mean pedagogically for you? Not suggesting that we need to have action or frame a solution, but rather what are your curiosities as they relate to your pedagogy? So post your portfolio entry 8 to Moodle by Saturday at 11:55 p.m. and respond to one other entry by Sunday at 11:55. Thanks, everyone.